back to LifePoint Students Online. It's another great week here in January, and we are actually in week 3 of the Acts series. So I appreciate you guys joining us today, as always. And what we really have been talking about, if you maybe you're just joining us or haven't had a chance to watch the other videos, is we're reviewing kind of how Acts is a history of the early church. It is kind of a continuation or kind of especially kind of closure about how Jesus hands everything off to the disciples, how the Holy Spirit comes. All these things are kind of rolled up. Well, and it's also the story of many other things to come, but all these things are rolled up in the book of Acts. And so where we kind of left off last week is we were talking about how the movement was empowered by the Holy Spirit. And this week we're kind of talking about how that movement grows and grows and grows. But before we kind of get ahead too far, I just want to remind you that, as my usual plug, hey, we're meeting in person. Please come and join us. Love to see you. And I appreciate you guys watching online. If you can't make it, please stay connected that way. Please stay involved that way. And when all of this is over, we hope that we all can get together soon. But in the meantime, if you feel you can come and you got a mask and you want to sit pretty distant and play some games, have some Bible study, come on Sunday nights starting at 6:30, and we'll kind of at least try to make some sort of normalness together, but if not, then we hope to see you soon. The other thing is, I mentioned last week that we are moving towards we're having Creation Festival happen. This is something, a long-standing event for what used to be Asylum youth, but is now LifePoint students. So Asylum youth used to go to Creation Festival. We want to continue that tradition. And at this point, Creation Fest is, again, still a go. It's exciting. I'm really looking forward to it. And again, at this point, hopefully, if nothing else happens, if nothing else delays or makes it impossible, then we are a go. And be on the lookout here again this week as we try to establish a way to online to have sign-ups and kind of show you some of the requirements for signing up and things like that, and payment and yada, yada, yada. But the main point is that all that is in the works, so be on the lookout for it. So let's actually jump in. Again, this is week 3. The movement is growing. The church is growing, really. And so it's funny I should kind of say this, so let's just do a quick recap. In chapter 2, we saw what happened when the Holy Spirit, the very presence of God, showed up and rested on the followers of Jesus. And what followed is that they started to speak in other languages, because all these Jews had gathered from all over the various countries and nations surrounding. In fact, it reached far and wide. They were in Jerusalem for the event for Pentecost, which again is a kind of a number of things. It's giving praise for the crops. It's also recognizing Moses receiving the 10 Commandments. And it's like 50 days after Passover. So all that time, the disciples were kind of gearing up and getting ready. And all of a sudden, the Holy Spirit empowers them. They start speaking in tongues at Pentecost. And from Jewish people from all over could understand them in these other foreign languages. Peter preached, after all this, Peter preached this epic sermon where he laid out how Jesus had fulfilled the Old Testament scriptures and that he was the resurrected King and Lord. Now, on that day, because of Peter and because of the Holy Spirit, well, really the Holy Spirit working through Peter, 3,000 people believed and chose to follow Jesus that day alone. So very quickly, like in the course of one afternoon, this very small movement started to grow rapidly. The Holy Spirit empowered them to be the messengers, or as Jesus said, witnesses to the rest of the world. And a new community began to kind of take shape. A community that we kind of call church today. So today we're actually going to look at that community and what did it look like? How did it function? What made it a community? Acts 2:42 through 47 says this, and they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship. The apostles, think of Jesus as disciples, but now they're kind of the teachers. They're kind of the leaders now. So they've kind of transitioned from student disciples to kind of leader, teacher, apostles. And the people they teach become their disciples, okay, or students. So they've devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. And what are they teaching? Jesus. The good news. They're teaching all that Jesus had shared with them to prepare them. They were devoted to the teaching and the fellowship and to the breaking of bread, eating together, living together. And they were in awe and came upon every soul. And they did begin to do many wonders, and signs were being done through the apostles. Again, not because they were the apostles, but through them. And all who believed were together and had all these things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all, as anyone had any kind of need. So they would sell their stuff and give to anyone who was in need within the group, within the community. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number, day by day, those who were being saved. So, what are we seeing here? Well, I think really it comes down to that something inside of us, even in the most introverted of us, is wired for relationships, community, really. We are built for community. And this is, I think, something that's part of God's creation for us, because He always intended us to have commune or communication, all these things with Him and amongst each other. We were to be, eventually, in God's first version, before Adam and Eve sinned, we were supposed to all be living in this perfect garden together. So we're kind of wired this way from God's creation of us. So it really should come as no surprise, speaking of communication and connectivity, that when you think about it, or when you consider our current technology and everything, that right now we are in the greatest age of connectivity that the world has really ever known. Think back to the Middle Ages, the medieval times, even just the early Americas or whatever. Messages used to take weeks, months maybe, to reach their destination. But despite all this connectivity, despite all this access to connectivity, the latest sociological studies show that although we are more connected, or have the ability to be connected, we also feel, by and large, more lonely and more unknown by others, perhaps even to ourselves, than we have ever felt. So just don't take my word for it. This is what we're finding. So why is that? What is missing? Acts 2:42 through 47 really kind of gives us the answer. Reflect on the very first words, if you will, from the passage. And they were this. And, verse 42, and they devoted themselves. And it goes on to say. So what is devoted? Well, what does devoted mean in Acts 2:42? To be devoted to something means to persist in adherence to, be intently engaged in, and to attend constantly, as in every moment should be bent, should be fashioned towards some kind of form of devotion. So, in this passage, these followers of Jesus were totally devoted. They didn't live their faith or be spiritual. They didn't just live their faith sometimes or be spiritual when they felt like it, or whenever it was convenient, or if they needed something from God on one day a week, perhaps Sunday. So this was not a matter of convenience, this was a way of life, really, because they had devoted themselves to that level. So no, this was something they were really devoted to. In fact, as we just said, they were persistent and intentional and consistent in everything. They had all these things. So if you were to reread that Acts 2, 42 through 47, again, I think you would find, of course you would find, because that's why I'm teaching it, that from the very beginning, we see 4 specific things that the disciples are devoted to. The first is the teachings, or the apostles' teaching. Again, teaching what? Teaching Christ. And they were devoted to the fellowship, which is sharing life together, the life of believers, encouraging, praying over each other. Speaking of prayers, that was one of them. They were devoted to breaking bread together. So what we would break that down to is eating together, breakfast, lunch, dinner. My family making dinner or lunch for your family, and you making it for all these other people. That was the way of life. They were devoted to living that way. Later we see mentioned in that passage other things that they were devoted to, which is providing for those in need. Again, this is a practice that Jesus encouraged. And as Christians, we should seek out these opportunities to serve or minister to other people. And they were already doing. It was part of just how they were doing things, because it was an overflow of that devotion. They were attending the temple and praising God together, two other things. And again, I should point out, all these things we mentioned are stuff they were doing daily. It wasn't just, again, one day a week. It wasn't just when it was convenient. It wasn't just when it fit into their lifestyle or other kind of like beliefs. It was what they did, period. So what is the result of all this devotion, all this living together, fellowshipping together, and all these things? It says in verse 47, and the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. So because of this, it just naturally drew in other people. They wanted what these people were having. And because of all of this, the text, not just what we read, but starting with what we read, is kind of the first of 8 summaries in the book of Acts about life of the early church. So this is kind of where Acts really gives us one of the kind of summaries, the first of 8, of what the early church was and what it looked like and what it kind of established. And in these verses, in this summary, it describes kind of what many have called, or what we believe are really the 5 main purposes or functions of the church today, as it was back then. So what did God purpose for the church to do? Well, those functions are discipleship, fellowship, ministry, worship, and evangelism. So remember, in those things, I mentioned them, and there's far more to each one of those than I really have time to give credit to or explain. We're going to here in a moment. But I mention them now because really all those things are what they were called to do, but it's what we're called to do. This is our story. It didn't stop with them. This is our story as a church, as a Christ follower. We are also called to be devoted. We agreed to be devoted when we first accepted Christ. So what we see here shows us who we are called to be. We should reflect what they did more than maybe what we're doing now. So with that, as we look at our lives, as we kind of reflect on where we are maybe as a nation, are these things, devotion, discipleship, ministry, fellowship, are these the things that we are devoted to? So if you're not familiar with them, let me break them down a little bit. Again, this won't do them justice. And if you're really a fan of describing these things or whatever, please just be gentle on me, because, again, this is just a quick overview. Discipleship is helping a person persons mature and grow in their faith. So that's learning, reading the Word, and kind of discerning what it says, helping someone discern what it says. Fellowship, which is enjoying time and life together. Again, and I should say that all these intermingle. You can fellowship while being discipled together or discipling together. You can fellowship when you're ministering or worshiping together, so on and so forth. You get the idea. But in fellowshipping together is eating together, it's journeying together. You get the idea. Ministry is we go out and we do things together. Mainly, we minister by serving the needy, reaching out, giving to those who don't have with what we have. And also ministry could be having an event, even something as like a VBS can be ministry because we're trying to bring in people and offer them a time or space to do something, right? So worship, again, is to purposely offer time in our day and our week together, to join together and purposely offer praise in recognition of God's power, His authority, His love, His grace, yeah, on and on. And then evangelism, which is that we want to share the good news. We need to share the good news with everyone around us or that we come in contact with. Now, often that might mean using words to express the good news, but most often is just living like the rest of these things around people through our actions. So, the early church experienced explosive growth because this new way of life, followers were being devoted to something that people could just not ignore. They were just doing it, and it was just out and about, and people were witnessing it everywhere. It was established by the lordship of Christ and empowered by the Holy Spirit. This thing took off, and there was no stopping it. And we know that. We see that. Other historical records show, like, no matter how many people tried to kill early Christians, no matter how many people tried to imprison early Christians, it only made it grow and grow more and more. And again, it can't be said enough. Their story should be our story. It's what we should continue that story. There should be no stopping us. Oh, what's that? You say something has stopped us? Well, that's interesting. Let's talk about that. Numerous studies have shown in the past few years that while some particular churches, individual churches, might have growth in terms of numbers, no major Christian denomination in America is growing. So, in fact, every single American denomination is shrinking. Now, how do I translate that? Well, people move to maybe this church or that church. They may stay a long time. Maybe they find a church that really feeds them spiritually. But very few people are coming to Christ to go to any of the churches altogether. So that doesn't mean there's zero. That's just, we've stalled. We have completely lost the motivation, the devotion to doing all those other things. So when I say we stalled, there are people who are strong in the faith who maybe have passed away, but there's not as many people coming in and replacing those numbers. We are shrinking. And so one really has to wonder, or one really has to ask, or we need to look at ourselves and examine. Again, ask ourselves, where is our devotion? Where does it lie? Well, again, I think we can ask, what are we deeming greater? What essentially has replaced Christ, what has essentially replaced that devotion to Christ and to the church? What requires, what has garnered that devotion from us? Is it the search of self, our identity, who we feel we are, who we want to be? Is it, maybe it's politics. or a political movement. Or, it could be sensuality. That one's kind of self-explanatory. But all these things are very common today and require a lot of devotion. We can rationalize this all day long. Well, I prefer this over that. They make me angry, so I'm over here. We can do that all day long, and you may have some powerful reasoning. However, if it's not devotion to Christ, the Bible really just calls it idolatry. That can offend you, that can challenge you, but ultimately that definition doesn't come from me, and that comes from the Bible. So if you have a problem with it, I would take it up with him. And again, sadly, this devotion we see all over, not just with one group, but with all groups. There's a mad kind of call to devotion, a very strong call for hyper devotion to these things. And imagine if we could take that same devotion that some have now for all these other things other than Christ. Imagine if we could be zeroed in on Christ, much like the early church. What could that do for God's kingdom? That's kind of the question I leave you with today. Because while I generally like to have these talks end on a positive note, or at least something to ponder or think about, certainly I leave you with that today. But I think this is about as positive as it gets on this subject. That we are facing a whole lot of stuff today in the church now. Not the early church had much to face as well. Probably not too dissimilar when you think in terms of the political climate, the balance of power, and all these other things. But that's no excuse. They had no excuse, and yet they plowed forward. They moved forward. They moved ahead. And we aren't there yet. And so I guess my challenge to you today to myself, is to ask, can we not be as devoted as they are? Should we not? And how can we do it together? So with that, I hope you have a wonderful and blessed day, and we'll talk to you later. Bye.